Thank you very much, and thank you, Anne, for this generous introduction. I was a visiting fellow here twice, actually, in 1998 to 2000, and then again in 2008. And both times, this visiting fellowship actually resulted in the publication of a book. So this is why I asked to actually to come and be here, so that it will be a push for my this new, relatively new, large project that I hope would result in a book. What you'll be hearing is a section of this big project. It's about questions of memory, silencing, selective remembrance of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in Lebanon, but also among Lebanese and Palestinians in Lebanon. It's work in progress, so I'm actually looking forward to your observations and your critique, constructive critique. There are a few events in the violent history of the Arab-Israeli conflict that have gained an iconic stature by all parties involved. The Sabra and Shatila massacre is one such event. Perpetrated on September 17th to 19th, 1982, in the midst of the Israeli incursion into Lebanon, a country which itself was embroiled in a vicious civil war and involving mostly Palestinians as victims, Lebanese as executioners, and Israelis as enablers and bystanders. The Sabra and Shatila massacre has gained a central place in the collective memories of these three societies. The massacre has also gained an iconic stature globally, becoming one of the few events that foreigners still identify today with both the Lebanese civil war and the Israeli invasion of that country. Still, despite this iconic stature, time and again, Palestinians, Lebanese, international observers, and sometimes even Israelis lament the fact that it is all but forgotten. Why, on the one hand, did the Lebanese filmmaker Ziad Doueri recently argued that, and I quote, Sabra and Shatila became like this crucifix. It became untouchable, like the mother of all massacres. That is in an interview he gave for his most recent movie, The Insult. Has anybody seen it? I have not seen it either, but I'm looking forward to seeing it because it is directly related to some of the issues that I'll be discussing here in this presentation. So on the one hand, Doueri tells us it's the mother of all massacres, it is untouchable. While on the other hand, the internationally renowned journalist Robert Fisk, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with his work, wrote on the 30th anniversary of the massacre that Sabra and Shatila is the forgotten massacre. How can one reconcile the repeated claims that the massacre and its victims have been erased from memory, and the fact that still many others consider it, and I quote again, the iconic massacre of the Lebanese Civil War? In my presentation, I will try to answer these questions in three stages. I will start by briefly discussing some conceptual terms from the field of memory studies and their relevance for this case study. I will then explore the question of victimhood among Lebanese and Palestinians in Lebanon as it relates to the memory of the massacre. And I will conclude with some brief observations about the place of the massacre in Israel's memories and commemoration of the First Lebanon War. Or at least this is how the war is called in Israel, the 1982 invasion of that country. My first argument is that the tension between seeing the massacre as a memory icon on the one hand and arguing that it is all but forgotten on the other hand does not lie in the memory-forgetting dichotomy, but in between, in the place where silence, denial, and perhaps selective remembrance reside. Silence and denial, I should emphasize, are not in action. Paul Simon captured it beautifully in his song, The Sound of Silence. Silence is not about inaction. Actually, it could be very, very noisy silence. Together with selective remembrance, silence and denial are better analytical tools in this case study than remembering and its evil twin, forgetting, which have dominated memory studies in the past 3 decades. After all, there is much more that deserves our attention in between the two ends of the memory in between the two ends of the memory studies spectrum, where these two concepts are located. This is particularly true in cases where the contemporary generation is still alive, holding strong personal memories of the event. The German cultural historian Jan Assermann called it a communicative memory, where the generation of contemporaries who witnessed or were part of an event can pass along without intermediacy their memories and experiences to the next generation. Still, if personal or communicative memories of this generation are not transformed into active collective remembrance, more often than not, it is not because of forgetfulness, but because of processes of silencing and denial on the part of the victims, the perpetrators, or both. And I should note also that the whole concept of communicative memory has been complicated in recent decades with the advent of mass media communication. And the case of Sabra and Shatila is actually very interesting to observe with regards to that concept of communicative memory, because CNN started broadcasting 24-hour live news in 1980. 1982 was one of the first events where you could turn on the TV and just watch the images coming from CNN, really 24 hours. In my archival work, I came across a very interesting exchange between President Regan and the Israeli Prime Minister Begin at a time where President Regan is really upset with what Israel is doing in Lebanon in 1982, just before the massacre. But he's writing Begin that he is upset because of what he watches on TV. Not because of CIA reports that he is being given, but he's writing, I'm watching CNN and it really makes me upset. So Trump is not the first president to come up with whatever based on watching TV. Silence is a useful concept, particularly when analyzing traumatic events such as the Sabra and Shatila massacre. This is true both for victims and perpetrators. Victims may silence their memories out of fear of continued exposure to violence. They may also become silent as a result of the magnitude of the trauma they have experienced. Victims may also be forced to silence their experience by the more powerful perpetrators. Perpetrators may be silencing their transgressions in order to exonerate themselves. They may also deny wrongdoings or choose to selectively remember and commemorate parts of the event that serve their interests. State agencies often play a central role in silencing the past. Post-war amnesty laws, often initiated by states, as in the case of the Lebanon Civil War, where in 1990-91 amnesty laws were passed by the Lebanese government. So these amnesty laws initiated by states have little to do with amnesia and a lot to do with silence and denial, so long as the war generation walks among us and the wounds of the war are still fresh in people's minds. Denial is a companion of silence. It allows us to suppress and or belittle the importance of a problematic event in our past. Like silence, denial is not about inaction or lack of knowledge. It is about a conscious decision to ignore a problematic event or occurrence for political, cultural, or social reasons. Silence and denial are good analytical tools in exploring the highly politicized landscape of civil war commemoration in Lebanon, in general, and that of the Sabra and Shatila massacre in particular. The massacre, after all, poses an intriguing dilemma concerning the memory and legacy of the Lebanese Civil War and the involvement of Israel therein. Given the centrality of Israel in enabling the massacre, it has been politically less problematic to underscore this massacre than to commemorate other civil war atrocities that involved Lebanese alone. Highlighting Israel as the prime culprit of the massacre also fits with the popular perception that frames the civil war as the war of the others, thus deflecting from Lebanese most of the responsibility for its eruption and long and violent duration. In the war of the others narrative, Lebanese are mere pawns, the prime victims of a war that was fought in their own country, but what was not of their own making. Moreover, Palestinians hold a central place in the war of the others narrative. To date, many Lebanese still see Palestinians as the prime catalyst for the eruption of the civil war, and as one of the principal others that have maliciously used Lebanon as an arena to gain their political objectives. I think here this new movie by Zohar Doueri would, at least according to the reviews that I have read, could fit well with my argument. Herein lies the dilemma. The Sabra and Shatila massacre highlights the victimhood of Palestinians during the Lebanese civil war in a country that all in all sees them not as victims, but as malign perpetrators. Lebanese and Palestinians have navigated this dilemma of victimhood not through the memory-forgetting dichotomy, but through the application of silence, denial, and selective remembrance. Indeed, at the heart of the discussion on the memory of Sabra and Shatila lies the question of victimhood. But victimhood, like all social categories, is socially constructed. The Norwegian criminologist Neil Christie coined the term ideal victim to denote a person who is seen by the general public as weak, respectable, and bears no responsibility for the crimes perpetrated against her or him. Christie added that the image of the ideal victim goes hand in hand with that of the ideal offender. While the ideal victim is the embodiment of innocence and purity, the ideal offender is the incarnation of evil. In fact, the ideal offender and the ideal victim are symbiotically tied to each other. One cannot be conceptualized without the other. The Sabra and Shatila massacre is often described through the prism of ideal victimhood versus ideal evil. To be sure, the victims of the massacre were indeed innocent. Almost all of them were unarmed civilians. Many were women, children, and the elderly. So just to be clear, in my elaborations on the victims of the massacre, I'm not trying to belittle the extent of their victimhood and the heinous crime that was perpetrated against them. One example where ideal victimhood and ideal evil is noticeable is in the book by the Palestinian Lebanese author and political activist Bayan Nuhed El-Hout, a book titled Sabra and Shatila, September 1982. This book is by far the most important and most comprehensive study on the massacre. El-Hout provides a historical context, an hour-by-hour chronology, survivors' testimonies, and she gets as close as possible to identifying most of the victims and the perpetrators. The book depicts the victims of the massacre as ideal and identifies Israel as an ideal offender. El-Hout's narrative presents the Sabra and Shatila massacre as pure innocence versus pure evil, and defines the massacre, and I quote, one of the most barbaric of the 20th century, end of quote, thus placing it on a par with mass atrocities of the last 100 years. Let me give you one example of this approach that also reflects a change in the ethos of the Palestinian national narrative that occurred in 1982. One of the central points of contention around the massacre was Israel's false claim that 2,500 terrorists remained in the camps, and that this is the reason for which Israel had to take over West Beirut, including Sabra and Shatila, after the assassination of Bashir al-Jumail. This has long been proven not only wrong, but an outright lie. And El-Hout engages with this issue at length in order to highlight the innocence of the victims. But in the process, El-Hout also reiterates time and again how insignificant was the Palestinian armed resistance inside the camps. She writes, and I quote, there had merely, it turned out, been small groups of young men carrying Kalashnikovs with the air of more angry patriots than of professional fighters, end of quotes. She's obviously right about this point. Otherwise, if there was any significant Palestinian resistance, the massacre would have terminated differently. But I would like to argue that only a few months earlier, before the 1982 invasion, these few Palestinians carrying Kalashnikovs would have been extolled as a symbol of the Palestinian armed struggle, as members of the Palestinian Thawra, or revolution, of which El-Hout herself was a prime speaker. Laleh Khalili, in her book Heroes and Martyrs of Palestine, The Politics of National Commemoration, shows how the Palestinian national narrative changed in 1982 from emphasizing heroism and bravery to highlighting victimhood. Indeed, the Sabra and Shatila massacre constitutes a turning point in the Palestinian national ethos, where the Palestinian victim took over the image of the bold, self-sacrificing fighter. Khalili also writes in her book she makes an interesting observation about the fact that before 1982, PLO leadership even discouraged collection of refugee testimonies from 1948 because it somehow challenged the image of the Palestinian fighter. But from 1982, a flood of oral projects of collecting testimonies of refugees from 1948. Erika Boris, in her book, Complex Political Victims, attempted to challenge the tendency for a simplified depiction of the ideal victim, which generates a simplified understanding of conflict and violence. Boris developed a theory of the complex political victim, which challenges the simple, what she calls the simple reductionist image of the innocent victim, to show more precisely the nuance and complexity of those suffering political victimization. And she tackles these projects heads on by choosing very challenging three cases. One is the Holocaust, the other is the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the third is the massacre of Bosnian civilians by Serbs in the 1990s. So she chooses very hard cases of victims in order to problematize this concept of political victims. Political victims, Boris argued, need to be understood in all of their complexities by taking into account sociopolitical factors, culture, and the victim's own perceptions of he or she as a victim. Boris' contribution to our understanding of victimhood could also be applied to offenders. Just as victims are politically complex, so are the offenders. But are the offenders of the Sabra and Shatila massacre ideal, as Al-Hut argues? The Israeli Kahan Commission that investigated the Sabra and Shatila massacre argued that Israel held indirect responsibility for the massacre because, as the occupying power, it was in charge of keeping order and safety in the area. Also, the Commission maintained that Israeli politicians and army officers should not have allowed the Phalange or Al-Kataib to enter the camps, given their past violent actions against Palestinians, and that the concern that they might seek to avenge the death of their leader, Bashir al-Jumail. Still, the Commission also strongly stated that not one single Israeli soldier was among the perpetrators of the massacre, highlighting, and I quote from the Commission's report, highlighting the difference between the usual battle ethics of the IDF and the battle ethics of the bloody clashes and combat actions among the various ethnic groups, militias, and fighting forces in Lebanon. The Commission drew a line between what it deemed as the immorality of the Lebanese executioners and the high moral ground of the Israeli soldiers and leadership. Expectedly, perhaps, the victims were not of major consideration for the Commission, since no testimonies were collected from them, and in fact they were practically absent from the deliberations of the Commission. And critics of the Commission clearly stated that it was just a cover-up, an Israeli cover-up to hide Israel's real intentions and actions during the massacre. For Al-Hut, however, the victims are the reason for which she spent years working on her book. The dedication of the book spells it out in remembrance of the victims of Sabra and Shatila. Moreover, Al-Hut saw the responsibility of Israel as diametrically different from the one argued by the Kahan Commission. For her, the massacre was not the result of haphazard and unfortunate decisions at a time of intense conflict. Rather, she argues that it was Israeli officials who actually connived and masterminded the massacre well in advance. She also argued that in addition to the Christian Phalange that carried out the massacre, the South Lebanon militia of Saad Haddad was among the perpetrators, thus bringing the executioners as close as possible to Israel itself. Highlighting the involvement of Israel in the massacre brings Sabra and Shatila into the orbit of the Arab-Israeli conflict, thus putting it in a particular political and historical context, and making it easier to draw on the ideal victim, ideal offender dichotomy. However, focusing on its Lebanese perpetrators puts the massacre in an intra-Lebanese and intra-Arab political context, which complicates this dichotomy. One of the few attempts to put a spotlight on the Lebanese perpetrators was done in the movie Slaughter, or better known in its German title, Massacre, produced and directed by the Lebanese publisher and memory activist Kaufman Slim and his wife Monica Borgman. In 2004, Slim and Borgman founded UMAM, a research and documentation center that focuses on collecting and producing material so as, and I quote from their website, boost collective reflection on the many different instances of conflict and violence that have plagued Lebanon's past, weigh heavily on its present, and have the potential to influence its future. One of the first initiatives of memory activism of UMAM was the making of the movie Massacre. The movie focuses on interviews with 6 phalangists who participated in the Sabra and Shatila massacre and who chillingly and nauseously recount their personal stories of the killing. The movie was shown many times in international film festivals, but has only been screened publicly in Lebanon a few times due to government censorship and lack of public interest. Slim and Borgman explained that they intentionally focused on the perpetrators rather than on the victims in order to, and I quote, tackle the Lebanese head-on about their past deeds. Complicating the victim-perpetrator dichotomy, Slim explains, personally, I don't think there are victims and perpetrators in this conflict. I think each perpetrator was a victim because he was amputated from a part of his humanity, and this amputation makes him a killer. If someone is at the same time a perpetrator and a victim, is he somehow less responsible for what he did? No. As long as we are not recognizing what we did towards each other, we will never reach a point of real reconciliation. UMAM has gained a reputation as one of the most important civil society organizations that challenges the culture of silence and denial of the civil war in Lebanon. Interestingly, in 2009, Slim and Borgman defied the Lebanese law that prohibits the screening of Israeli movies in the country and held in UMAM a private screening of the Israeli movie Waltz with Bashir. I don't know how many of you have seen it. It's a movie that also deals with the Sabra and Shatila massacre, though from a perspective of an Israeli soldier who 20 years later retrieves his suppressed memories of his role in the event. I will return to the movie, to Waltz with Bashir in a few minutes. Obviously, not all Lebanese see any dilemma in highlighting the victimhood of Palestinians in the context of the Lebanese civil war. Some Lebanese, I would say, instrumentalize the victimhood, and I can give you some examples from Hezbollah, and others are approaching the victimhood of Palestinians from, I would say, a more holistic, genuine place. One such prime example is the Lebanese author Elias Al-Khouri, whose book Bab al-Shams is an epic story of Palestinian struggles and survivals, including their experiences during and after the Sabra and Shatila massacre. Al-Khouri has been known for his pro-Palestinian activism in Lebanon, and his book, which deserves a longer discussion here, complicates the victim-offender dichotomy without compromising the victim's humanity and suffering. Another example is that of the Lebanese lawyer and political activist Shibli Mlat. In 2001, Mlat filed a criminal complaint in a Belgian court on behalf of 28 witnesses and survivors of the 1982 massacre against Ariel Sharon and several members of the Lebanese Christian militias, charging them with war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Although this legal procedure ultimately failed due to immense political pressure from Israel and some of its allies, It was a testament on a global scale that Sabra and Shatila is not a forgotten massacre. In fact, the trial highlighted its centrality in international human rights circles and also served as a reminder for Israelis and Lebanese of the fact that not even one perpetrator from either society was held responsible for it. For Mlat, the question of Sabra and Shatila was not that of remembering versus forgetting. Rather, it was a question of justice versus impunity. He wrote, "Despite arguments both intricate and wide-ranging, the moral issue is simple. Would the victims of one of the terrible landmarks in the late 20th century be able to get some compensation, some relief for their silent suffering? Would the man who was the commander of the operation, Ariel Sharon, along with the aides and the executioners, finally be brought to account? Until some justice comes to the victims, the Sabra and Shatila case will never be closed." Mlat words make us think about the man, Ariel Sharon, mostly identified with the massacre, and the place of the Sabra and Shatila, in the memory of the First Lebanon War in Israel. Apparently, again, according to my reading of the reviews of the movie by Dueri, the insult, Ariel Sharon is the insult. A Christian Lebanese insults a Palestinian by telling him, "I wish Ariel Sharon wiped you all out back then in 1982. So I'm really intrigued to see how the movie could be weaved into this draft. So one might expect that the massacre would be completely erased from public memory in Israel. But in fact, Sabra and Shatila is still one of the very few events of this war that Israelis still associate with their invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Scholars have named the First Lebanon War a forgotten war, the war Israeli scholars, a forgotten war, the war that never was, or a repressed war, alluding to the fact that out of all wars fought by Israel, this one has been removed from public awareness. But also here, and I have written about that in a different piece, I would argue that it is not forgetting, but rather silence and denial that dominates the Israeli engagement with this war, and then of Sabra and Shatila. Paradoxically, it is the prominence of Ariel Sharon in Israel's politics that has kept the massacre in public eye. Sharon's political career seemed to have been terminated following the recommendation of the Kahan Commission that found him personally responsible for allowing the Phalange to enter the camps. But Sharon persistently not only remained in Israeli politics, but slowly but surely returned to prominence and became prime minister in 2001 and again in 2005 in landslide victories. And now if you come to visit Israel, streets named after him, there is a huge public park, arguably the biggest park, Oren Park, bigger even than Central Square, that is being constructed outside of Tel Aviv, and it is called the Sharon Park. Complete rehabilitation. Every step in his political comeback was accompanied by a discussion in the media about the Kahan Commission and the extent of his responsibility for the massacre. Every step up was also accompanied by public silence and indifference. The 2008 movie Waltz with Bashir is another indication of the fact that out of the entire fiasco of the First Lebanon War, Sabra and Shatila still has not disappeared into oblivion in Israel. Still, the movie puts the spotlight not on the trauma of the victims of the massacre, but rather on the trauma of the Israeli soldiers who facilitated it. The movie, in fact, helps in exonerating Israeli society by and large by limiting its criticism on Ariel Sharon and a few other politicians around him. But Ariel Sharon has long been exonerated, as I've already said, by Israeli society for his responsibility for the 1982 war and for his role in the massacre. This process happened, as I've now argued several times, not through forgetfulness, but through silence, denial, and indifference. Sabra and Shatila has become an iconic massacre for Lebanese, Palestinians, and Israelis, as well as internationally. And I'm not going to speak about the international aspect of it, but I'm happy to answer questions about that if there is an interest here. The sociologist Barry Schwartz called this phenomena of focusing on using one event as a center or focus of bigger complex events, as he called it, the symbolic power of oneness. A process in which collective memories of complex events are anchored around one person or occurrence. Schwartz coined this term actually in thinking about the civil rights movement in the United States and the centrality of Rosa Parks in the commemoration of that Rosa Parks has been elevated, and this is what now most Americans remember and think about when they even study the civil rights movement, despite the fact that there were so many other factors, other people, some even women that did exactly what she did even before her, but didn't get recognized. So I'm borrowing a term that he used in an entirely different context, and I'm applying it to the case of Sabra and Shatila because I think it has this same function. One event that helps us anchor our thoughts, our memories on far more complex occurrences. Returning to the starting quotes of the paper, when Robert Fisk writes about the forgotten massacre, what he really means, in my view, is that the perpetrators have not been accounted for. When Ziad Doueri writes that Sabra and Shatila has become the mother of all massacres, what he means is that given its political volatility, the massacre has been dehistoricized, remembered as an icon, perhaps as a symbolic oneness, but stripped of historical and political context. To rehistoricize it, a different political climate would be needed in Lebanon, as well as among Israelis and Palestinians. In the meantime, for us, it is through the study of dynamics of silencing and denial that we can best understand the place of the massacre in these societies and the dynamics of war commemoration among Israelis, Lebanese, and Palestinians. Thank you very much. Lots of stuff.